Maya Dawson, a rising attorney, faced the challenge of her career when she crossed paths with Ethan Cole, an arrogant lawyer who underestimated her in a tense parking lot encounter. Little did he know, she was the opposing counsel in a high-stakes legal battle that would soon spiral into a personal feud. As Ethan's desperation grew, their clash would extend beyond the courtroom, leading to a confrontation that could change everything. Would Maya's resilience be enough to overcome the odds, or would Ethan's actions push things too far? Maya Dawson pulled into the courthouse parking lot, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she mentally rehearsed her arguments. Today marked one of the biggest trials of her career, representing David Brooks, a small business owner wrongfully sued by a powerful corporation. The stakes were immense, and the heat outside mirrored the weight of her anxiety. But Maya wasn't one to crumble under pressure. She'd faced both personal and professional hurdles before, and always emerged stronger. Her sharp eyes spotted an open parking space near the courthouse entrance. It felt like a good omen, a small victory to start the day. She flipped on her blinker and began to turn when, out of nowhere, a sleek black SUV cut in front of her, screeching to a halt in the space. Maya's heart raced from the near collision. The driver hadn't even bothered to look. Frustration surged, but she took a deep breath, steadying herself. She couldn't afford distractions today. The SUV's door swung open, and out stepped a tall man in an impeccably tailored navy suit, sunglasses perched arrogantly on his head. He glanced at Maya, their eyes briefly meeting, his gaze filled with a sneer, hers with disbelief. He strode toward her car with the same entitlement he'd used to steal her parking spot. "Hey," he barked, his voice cold and accusatory. "You almost hit my car. Do you realize how close you came?" Maya's grip on the wheel tightened. Was he serious? "Excuse me," she replied, her tone calm despite the rising anger. The man crossed his arms, standing too close to her window. "You heard me. You need to be more careful." She couldn't believe his audacity. She'd clearly been signaling for the spot, and he had cut her off. Rolling down the window a bit more, Maya's eyes narrowed. "I had my signal on. You cut me off." He chuckled, dripping with condescension. "Maybe you should have been quicker. Doesn't matter now, does it?" He gestured dismissively toward the lot. "I'm sure you can find another spot." Maya wanted to argue, to put him in his place. But experience had taught her that people like him thrived on conflict, feeding off the chance to feel superior. He didn't deserve the satisfaction. Maya straightened in her seat, fixing him with a steady gaze. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The man raised an eyebrow, smirking as though her words were nothing more than idle threats. "Oh, I think I do. People like you." He glanced at her car with disdain. "Don't usually drive these unless you got lucky or rented it for the day." The sting of his words, laced with arrogance and racism, was sharp. This wasn't just about a parking spot anymore. He had made assumptions about her based on nothing but the surface of her life, her skin, her car, her appearance. But Maya refused to let him win. "I'd advise you to be careful," she said, her voice quiet but firm. For a moment his smile faltered. He tapped the roof of her car twice before walking away, his smugness intact. Maya watched him go, her anger simmering but under control. Closing her eyes briefly, she took a deep breath, refocusing. She had more important things to handle today. This man wasn't worth her energy. With a renewed sense of purpose, Maya stepped out of her car, grabbed her briefcase, and made her way to the courthouse. Inside, the air conditioning was a welcome relief. The bustling hallways buzzed with hushed conversations, lawyers preparing their cases, clients nervously fidgeting with their ties or phones, clerks rushing past with stacks of paperwork. The courthouse was a machine, always in motion, and today it felt like it was turning just for her. Maya entered the courtroom and placed her briefcase down at the table, her movements precise, practiced. She had spent weeks preparing for this trial, studying every detail, anticipating every move the opposing counsel might make. This case wasn't just crucial for her client, David Brooks. It was a turning point for her career. Winning today would prove, to her firm and herself, that she was ready to take on the most significant cases. David hadn't arrived yet, but Maya knew he was as anxious as she was. A small business owner who had poured his heart and soul into his company, only to be wrongfully sued by a corporate giant for an alleged breach of contract. It was a classic case of the big guy trying to crush the little guy, and Maya had vowed to fight for him. She believed in justice, and today, she was determined to show that no matter how powerful the opposition, they couldn't bulldoze over the truth. As she reviewed her notes, the courtroom doors opened. Footsteps echoed across the marble floor. Maya glanced up, her heart skipping a beat when she saw who had just entered. It was him, the man from the parking lot. Their eyes locked again, and Maya saw the shock written across his face. The confident smirk Ethan Cole had worn earlier vanished, replaced by disbelief. He stood frozen, staring at Maya as if he couldn't process what he was seeing. The man who had arrogantly dismissed her in the parking lot was none other than her opposing counsel. Maya felt a surge of satisfaction watching him struggle to regain his composure. Ethan had written her off too easily, assuming she was insignificant, just another woman to brush aside. But now, here they were, facing each other in court. She could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the realization that he had severely misjudged her. Ethan quickly masked his surprise, straightening his tie and walking to his table with exaggerated calm. He avoided looking directly at Maya, but she could tell their earlier encounter had rattled him. This was not going to be the easy victory he had expected. Maya smiled inwardly but kept her expression professional and neutral. There was no need to show her emotions yet. The real battle was about to begin, and she needed to stay focused. Glancing at her notes one last time, her mind sharpened with purpose as the judge entered the room, calling the trial to order. Maya sat up straight, her heart steady and her mind clear. This was her moment. She was ready. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the trial began. Ethan was the first to deliver his opening statement, and Maya watched him closely, her eyes never leaving his face. She sensed the tension beneath his calm exterior, the way his hands gripped the edges of the podium just a little too tightly, the slight tremble in his voice as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Ethan began, his voice loud and commanding, though it lacked the confidence she'd expected. "My client, a well-respected corporation, has been wrongfully accused of breaching a contract. The truth is, Mr. Brooks, the plaintiff, failed to fulfill his obligations, resulting in substantial losses for my client." Maya listened intently, noting how well-crafted but predictable his argument was. It was exactly what she had anticipated, and she was ready to counter every point. But more than that, she noticed the cracks in Ethan's delivery. Small, but telling. He wasn't as composed as he wanted to appear. His eyes flicked toward her once, twice. Brief, nervous glances that betrayed his unease. It wasn't just her role as opposing counsel that unsettled him. It was the realization that he had underestimated her, and now he was paying the price. When Ethan finished, he returned to his seat with a quick glance in Maya's direction, as if waiting for her reaction. She didn't give him one. Instead, she stood calmly, smoothing her jacket before walking toward the jury. Her opening statement was deliberate and precise, every word chosen to build her case. She didn't need theatrics or a raised voice. Her argument spoke for itself. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Maya began, her voice steady and clear, "this is a classic case of David versus Goliath. My client, David Brooks, has done everything in his power to honor his contract, but the corporation represented by Mr. Cole has used its power and influence to bully and intimidate him, trying to force him into a corner. Today we will show you the truth. My client has been wronged." As she spoke, Maya could feel the room shifting in her favor. The jury was engaged, drawn in by her calm confidence and the clarity of her argument. Across the room, Ethan sat stiffly, gripping his pen a little too tightly. When she returned to her seat, Maya could sense the momentum shifting. Ethan may have walked into the courtroom with his usual arrogance, but now he was the one feeling the pressure. The trial had only just begun, but Maya already knew she had the upper hand. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension as the judge called for the first round of witness testimonies. Ethan stood, striding toward the witness box with renewed confidence, or at least the appearance of it. His first witness was a senior executive from the corporation he represented, a man clearly coached on what to say. Ethan's questions were sharp, almost aggressive, as he led the executive through testimony that painted the corporation as a victim and David Brooks as a small business owner out of his depth. Maya listened carefully, making notes as Ethan laid out his case. His approach was predictable but effective. He was framing David as unreliable, a man who had entered into a deal far beyond his capabilities. Ethan was counting on this narrative to sway the jury, but Maya remained unfazed. She had anticipated this strategy. When it was her turn to cross-examine the executive, Maya stood slowly, letting the moment hang in the air for just a beat longer than necessary. Then, with a calm and measured pace, she approached the witness box. "Mr. Hall," Maya began, her voice soft but authoritative, "you mentioned earlier that my client, Mr. Brooks, failed to deliver on certain aspects of the contract, correct?" "Yes," the executive replied, his tone crisp, rehearsed. "And yet," Maya continued, "your corporation worked with him for nearly 2 years before filing this lawsuit. If Mr. Brooks was so unreliable, why continue to do business with him?" The executive shifted in his seat, glancing toward Ethan, who subtly shook his head, signaling him to stay on script. "Well, we believed that Mr. Brooks could eventually meet the contract's requirements. We were giving him time to correct his mistakes." Maya's eyes narrowed. "So you continued working with a partner you claim was repeatedly breaching the contract, out of goodwill?" The executive paused, clearly uncomfortable. "That's correct." Maya smiled slightly, knowing she had him. "I see. And could you tell the jury when exactly your corporation decided that Mr. Brooks was no longer worth working with?" The executive fumbled for words, his confidence shaken. It was after a series of incidents that showed a consistent failure to meet our expectations." Maya nodded, pacing slowly back to her table, then paused. "And was this decision made before or after Mr. Brooks refused to sign the new, more expensive contract your corporation offered him?" The question hung in the air, and the executive's face blanched. The jury's eyes widened, sensing the trap Maya had just sprung. The corporation hadn't sued David for contract breaches. They had sued him because he refused to be strong-armed into paying more. Ethan shot to his feet. "Objection, relevance." The judge eyed Maya with interest. "I'll allow it." Maya smiled, turning back to the witness. "Mr. Hall, would you care to explain why, after my client refused to sign your new contract, your corporation suddenly decided he was no longer a valuable partner?" The executive squirmed, glancing again at Ethan for help, but there was no saving him now. It was a business decision," he muttered. "A business decision." Maya nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Hall. No further questions." As Maya returned to her seat, she could feel the room shifting even more. Ethan's carefully crafted narrative was beginning to unravel, and the jury was starting to see through the corporate spin. Maya had successfully planted doubt in their minds, and she knew it was just the beginning. After the first round of testimonies, a slight wave of relief washed over her. The morning had gone well, but she was fully aware the battle was far from over. Ethan, though shaken, was still a formidable opponent. He was experienced and backed by endless resources. The corporation would throw everything they had into this case, and Maya needed to be ready for every possible angle. That afternoon, during a brief recess, Maya sat outside the courthouse on a stone bench, sipping coffee and reviewing her notes. Her phone buzzed. Glancing down, she saw a message from Julie Anderson, her mentor and senior partner at the firm. "You're doing great so far. Keep the pressure on. Ethan's not used to losing." Maya smiled at the message, feeling a renewed sense of confidence. Julia had always believed in her, even when Maya doubted herself. But now wasn't the time for self-doubt. She had to stay sharp. Her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. "Impressive work in there." Maya looked up to see Ethan standing a few feet away, hands in his pockets, his face impassive. Gone was the arrogance he had shown earlier in the parking lot. Now, he seemed curious. "Thanks," Maya replied, keeping her tone neutral. She wasn't about to let him throw her off her game. Ethan sat down on the bench next to her, his eyes scanning the bustling street in front of the courthouse. "I didn't expect you to be this prepared." Maya raised an eyebrow. "You underestimated me." He shrugged, offering her a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I've been doing this a long time. Most people would have cracked by now." Maya chuckled softly, glancing sideways at him. "Maybe you're used to people who aren't willing to fight back." Ethan's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But this case isn't over. You won't win." Maya's expression remained unchanged, but inside her resolve hardened. Ethan's words were meant to intimidate, to seed doubt. But she wasn't backing down. "We'll see," she said simply, standing and walking back into the courthouse, leaving Ethan on the bench, staring after her. The following day, the trial resumed, and Ethan came out swinging. Determined to regain control of the narrative, he had clearly spent the night strategizing. His first move was a surprise. He called a witness Maya hadn't anticipated, a former business partner of David Brooks. The witness, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a nervous demeanor, took the stand. Ethan's questioning was sharp and ruthless. "Mr. Anderson, isn't it true that Mr. Brooks has a history of failing to meet his business obligations?" Ethan asked, pacing in front of the witness stand. The man hesitated, glancing at David, who sat beside Maya, his face pale. "Well, yes, there were times we had issues." Ethan smiled, sensing victory. "And wasn't it your experience that Mr. Brooks often struggled to fulfill his contracts on time, causing delays and financial losses for your business?" The witness swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable. "Yes, but no further questions," Ethan said, cutting him off and turning to the jury with a triumphant look. A knot formed in Maya's stomach. This witness could be damaging if she didn't handle it correctly. She stood, her heart pounding, and approached the stand. "Mr. Anderson," Maya began, her voice calm and soothing, "you mentioned there were issues in your business dealings with my client, correct?" The witness nodded. "Yes, but," Maya interjected gently, "those issues weren't entirely my client's fault, were they? In fact, wasn't your business struggling at the time? And many of the delays were due to external factors beyond Mr. Brooks's control, correct?" The witness hesitated, glancing nervously at Ethan, who was glaring at him. "That's true," the man finally admitted. Maya pressed on, her voice steady. "So would it be fair to say that while there were difficulties, Mr. Brooks was not solely responsible for the challenges your business faced?" The witness nodded reluctantly. "Yes, that would be fair." Maya smiled warmly. "Thank you, Mr. Anderson. No further questions." As she returned to her seat, the weight lifted from her chest. Ethan's surprise witness had backfired. The jury now saw that any issues David had in the past were not due to incompetence, but external circumstances. Ethan's frustration was evident as he shuffled through his papers, his confidence slipping with each passing hour. That night, Maya sat alone in her apartment staring at the piles of legal documents spread out on her dining table. The trial was going well so far, but the pressure was taking its toll. Ethan was throwing new challenges at her every day, trying to break her down. While she had managed to counter most of his tactics, there was still a nagging doubt in the back of her mind. What if she lost? What if, despite all her preparation and hard work, she couldn't win this case? She reached for her phone and hesitated for a moment before dialing Julia's number. "Julia," Maya said when her mentor picked up. "I don't know if I'm ready for this. Ethan's coming at me from all sides, and I'm starting to feel like I'm losing control." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Julia spoke, her voice calm and reassuring. "Maya, You're one of the best lawyers I've ever seen. You've prepared for this moment your entire career. Don't let Ethan get into your head. He's trying to make you doubt yourself because he's afraid of you." Maya exhaled, the weight on her chest easing slightly. "You really think I can win this?" "I know you can," Julia replied. "And more importantly, I know you won't give up. Keep pushing. You've got him on the ropes." Maya hung up the phone and stared out the window at the city lights. Julia was right. Ethan might be trying to intimidate her, but she had come too far to back down now. With renewed determination, Maya returned to her notes, preparing for the next day in court. The following morning, Maya arrived at the courthouse early, her mind focused and sharp. The pressure was building, but she was ready. Ethan had played dirty, but now it was her turn to deliver a decisive blow. As the trial resumed, Ethan called another witness, hoping to regain control. But this time, Maya was ready. She stood and objected before Ethan could even get started, arguing that the witness's testimony was irrelevant and purely speculative. The judge agreed, striking the witness from the record. Ethan's face reddened with frustration as Maya's objection landed. She could see the cracks in his confidence growing, his arrogance fading. He was losing control, and Maya knew that if she kept pushing, she could break him. And that's exactly what she intended to do. Ethan's frustration was evident in every move he made, quick glances at the jury, the way he shuffled his papers, and the tightness in his voice as he tried to regain control of the narrative. But Maya wasn't giving him any openings. Her next move was critical. The trial had reached a point where every argument, every piece of evidence had to hit hard. Maya called her first key witness, a former contractor who had worked for David Brooks, someone who could testify to David's honesty and professionalism, directly countering the image Ethan had tried to paint. The witness, a middle-aged woman named Clara Reed, took the stand. Maya approached her with the same calm confidence that had carried her through the trial. "Ms. Reed, could you please tell the court about your experience working with Mr. Brooks?" Clara nodded. "I worked with Mr. Brooks for several years. He was always fair and reliable. Whenever we faced challenges on a project, he went out of his way to fix them, even when it wasn't his responsibility." Maya smiled, sensing Clara's testimony was resonating with the jury. "So, in your experience, Mr. Brooks was committed to honoring his agreements?" "Absolutely," Clara replied. "David took pride in his work. He wasn't the type to cut corners or breach contracts." Maya glanced at Ethan, who was fidgeting in his seat. His confidence, once seemingly unshakable, was visibly cracking. "Thank you, Ms. Reed. No further questions." As Clara stepped down, Maya could see the jury taking notes, nodding slightly. The tide was shifting, and they were starting to see David for who he truly was, a hard-working man, fighting against corporate greed. Ethan stood, clearly trying to regain control. He approached the witness stand with a forced smile. "Ms. Reed, you mentioned that Mr. Brooks was reliable, but isn't it true that there were delays on several of his projects?" he asked, attempting to poke holes in her testimony. Clara hesitated, glancing at Maya briefly before answering. "There were delays, yes, but they were caused by factors outside of David's control. Weather, supply chain issues, things like that. David always did his best to minimize them." Ethan's smile faltered, his tone becoming more aggressive. "But delays cost money, don't they? And wouldn't those delays have negatively impacted Mr. Brooks's clients?" Clara stood her ground, her voice steady. David communicated with his clients throughout every project. He made sure they understood what was happening and worked to solve problems as quickly as possible. Ethan's frustration was palpable as he returned to his seat, his attempts to discredit David falling flat. Maya remained calm, knowing that each of Ethan's moves only further solidified her case. That evening, after a long day in court, Maya returned home exhausted but satisfied with how the trial was progressing. She sank onto her couch, her mind still buzzing with the day's events. Her phone rang. It was David Brooks. "Maya," David began, his voice filled with anxiety. "I just got a call from one of my suppliers. They're pulling out of our deal. They don't want to be associated with a business involved in a high-profile lawsuit. Maya closed her eyes, a wave of frustration washing over her. She had warned David this could happen, that fighting a corporate giant like Ethan's client could lead to collateral damage. But hearing it now in the midst of the trial felt like a gut punch. "I'm so sorry, David," Maya said softly. "This is exactly why we need to win. We need to clear your name and show everyone that this lawsuit is baseless." David sighed. "I just don't know how much more of this I can take. Every day it feels like I'm losing more." Maya felt a pang of guilt. She had promised to fight for David, and while the trial was going well so far, the personal toll on him was becoming more apparent. "I know it's hard," she replied, her voice firm despite the emotion she felt. "But I believe in you, David. We're going to get through this." After hanging up, Maya sat in silence, the weight of the trial pressing down on her. She knew the toll it was taking on both of them, but she couldn't let herself be distracted by the personal cost. She had to stay focused. Across town, Ethan wasn't faring much better. His personal life was starting to unravel, and the pressure of the trial was pushing him to his breaking point. That night, his wife Rachel confronted him in their spacious, coldly decorated living room. "Ethan, what's happening to you?" Rachel asked, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You've been obsessed with this case for weeks, and now you're starting to lose it." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, pacing back and forth. "You don't understand. This case is everything. If I lose, it's not just a blow to my reputation. It's the end of my career." Rachel shook her head, exasperated. "You've always cared more about your career than anything else, haven't you? But now it's different. You're different." Ethan stopped pacing, turning to face her. "What's that supposed to mean?" Rachel's expression softened, but her voice was filled with sadness. "You've always been arrogant, Ethan, but this case, it's consuming you. You're losing control and you're starting to lash out at everyone around you." Ethan's jaw clenched, his temper flaring. "I'm not losing control. I'm just dealing with the pressure." But Rachel wasn't buying it. "If you keep going down this path, you're going to lose more than just this case, Ethan. You're going to lose everything." She turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing alone in the living room, the weight of her words sinking in. He knew she was right. The trial wasn't just a battle for his client. It had become a personal war against Maya, a war he was losing. The next day in court, the tension was palpable. Both sides knew the trial was reaching a critical juncture, and every word spoken, every argument made, carried enormous weight. Ethan's confidence, once rock solid, had eroded over the course of the trial, and his attempts to discredit Maya's case were becoming increasingly desperate. David had fallen flat, and Maya had successfully countered every argument Ethan made. Now, he was left scrambling, desperate to regain the upper hand. Ethan stood to deliver his closing arguments, his voice tense but controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my client has done everything in their power to honor their contracts. They've been forced into this lawsuit by a business owner who, while hardworking, simply couldn't meet the demands of the agreement." He paused, glancing at the jury, his eyes hard. "This isn't about bullying the little guy. It's about holding people accountable for their failures." Maya watched him carefully, sensing the desperation behind his words. He was trying to salvage his case, but the jury wasn't convinced. She could see it in their faces. They were tired of his aggressive tactics, tired of hearing the same baseless accusations. When it was Maya's turn, she stood with quiet confidence, her eyes meeting each member of the jury as she began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice calm and clear, "this case is not about holding someone accountable for their failures. It's about justice. It's about a hardworking man, my client, David Brooks, who has done everything in his power to honor his commitments, only to be wrongfully sued by a corporation that saw an opportunity to take advantage of him." She paused, letting her words sink in. "This case is about power. It's about how corporations use their size and influence to crush the people who stand in their way. But today you have the opportunity to stand up for what's right, to show that justice cannot be bought. Maya's voice grew stronger as she reached her final point. I ask you to see the truth in this case, to see the person behind the lawsuit, and to deliver the justice that David Brooks deserves. As Maya sat down, the jury was silent, their expressions thoughtful. She had done everything she could to present her case, and now, it was in their hands. The jury deliberated for hours, leaving both sides in tense anticipation. Maya sat at her table, her heart pounding despite the calm facade she maintained. David sat beside her, his hands trembling as he nervously flipped through the papers on the table. Across the room, Ethan sat rigidly in his seat, his expression unreadable. His entire career, his reputation, and his pride were on the line. Finally, the jury filed back into the courtroom, and the tension in the room rose to a fever pitch. The foreman stood holding the verdict in his hands. In the matter of Brooks versus Capital Enterprises, the foreman began, his voice steady. We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, David Brooks. The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before reality sank in. Maya had won. David let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his eyes welling with tears as he turned to Maya. We did it, he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. Maya smiled, her own eyes glistening with relief and satisfaction. We did. Across the room, Ethan sat motionless, his face drained of color. He had lost the trial, the fight. His reputation was gone. As the courtroom buzzed with the aftermath of the verdict, Maya remained calm and composed. This was a victory, but it wasn't just about winning the trial. It was about standing up for what was right. It was about showing that justice could prevail, even when the odds were stacked against you. Maya Dawson had won the trial, and David Brooks had been vindicated. The courtroom's energy shifted in her favor as whispers of victory filled the halls. But as she gathered her papers and prepared to leave, the real weight of what had just happened settled on her. The battle was over, but not entirely. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last she'd hear from Ethan Cole. Across the courtroom, Ethan sat still, his jaw clenched tightly, his face devoid of its usual confidence. The man who had belittled her in the parking lot just days ago now looked as though he'd been stripped of his armor. Maya had seen that look before. Men like Ethan didn't take defeat well. As the courtroom emptied, she kept her eye on him, half expecting some last-ditch attempt to regain control. But he simply stared at the table in front of him, a strange calmness on his face that seemed far more dangerous than anger. Outside, David was waiting for her, a mix of gratitude and disbelief in his eyes. He shook Maya's hand with both of his voice trembling. Thank you, Maya. You've saved my business and my family. I don't even know how to repay you. You don't have to, Maya said, smiling. This was never about money or prestige. It was about doing the right thing. David nodded, his eyes misty with emotion. I'll never forget what you've done for me. As David walked away, Maya's thoughts drifted back to Ethan. She knew the trial had been personal for him, though she didn't fully understand why. But now, with his reputation shattered, she wondered what Ethan would do next. She could feel the pressure building, for him and for her. Something about this didn't feel over. That evening, Maya found herself sitting in her apartment, staring out at the cityscape. The lights glittered against the dark sky, and the hum of life in the streets below was oddly comforting. Her victory today had been significant, but it didn't feel as triumphant as she had expected. Instead of celebrating, she found herself thinking back to the confrontation with Ethan in the parking lot. How easily he had dismissed her, how smug he had been, assuming she didn't belong in the same courtroom as him. She had proven him wrong, but the victory felt hollow. It wasn't just about the case. It was about something deeper. It was about fighting against years of underestimation, microaggressions, and being pushed aside. Maya took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment. She had won, yes. But the real victory wasn't just in the courtroom. It was in knowing that she could stand up to people like Ethan and refuse to let them define her worth. She had earned her place, and no one, especially not Ethan Cole, could take that away from her. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was Julia Anderson, her mentor, calling to congratulate her. "Maya." Julia's voice was warm and filled with pride. "I knew you'd win. You handled yourself perfectly." "Thanks, Julia. I have to admit, I wasn't sure how it would go there for a while." Julia chuckled lightly. "Ethan's arrogant, not tough. He's not used to losing, so you rattled him. But keep your guard up. Guys like him don't just disappear when they lose, they come back fighting." Maya nodded even though Julia couldn't see her. "I know. He looked different today. Defeated, but not done." "Exactly," Julia said. "You've got the upper hand now, but don't get complacent. He'll try something. You can count on it." Maya thanked her mentor again before hanging up. She knew Julia was right. Something was brewing in the aftermath of the trial, and she needed to stay sharp. Ethan sat in the dim light of his office late that night, staring at the piles of documents on his desk. The courthouse had long since emptied, but his mind was still spinning. He had lost. To her. The woman he had dismissed so easily in the parking lot had torn his case apart piece by piece, and now his client was threatening to pull their contracts. His phone rang, the harsh sound cutting through the stillness of the room. It was his client, the CEO of Capital Enterprises, demanding answers. "You told me this case was a guaranteed win," the man growled. "What the hell happened?" Ethan stammered, trying to find the right words. I prepared thoroughly, but she blindsided us. Maya Dawson, she's good." "I don't care how good she is," the CEO barked. "You're supposed to be better. You promised me a different outcome, and now we're facing a PR nightmare. I'm pulling my contracts with your firm." The line went dead before Ethan could respond. He slammed the phone down, cursing under his breath. His career was crumbling around him, and it was all because of Maya Dawson. She had embarrassed him, stripped him of his power, and now he was left scrambling to pick up the pieces. But Ethan wasn't one to accept defeat quietly. He wouldn't let Maya walk away without consequences. The next day, Maya found herself facing a different kind of confrontation. Ethan had filed a motion for appeal, claiming misconduct on her part during the trial. He accused her of deliberately hiding evidence and using underhanded tactics to sway the jury. It was a blatant lie, and Maya knew it. But it was also an effective strategy. If the motion went through, it would delay the case, possibly reopen the trial, and worst of all, it would cast doubt on Maya's ethics and professionalism. Ethan knew exactly what he was doing. He was trying to tarnish her reputation in the same way she had crushed his. Maya's anger simmered beneath the surface as she reviewed the paperwork. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was personal. Ethan was willing to drag her name through the mud to salvage his pride. The next morning, Maya arrived at her firm, her jaw clenched and her mind racing. She knew she had done nothing wrong, but the weight of Ethan's accusations hung over her like a dark cloud. As she walked into the conference room, Julia was already there, flipping through the motion papers. "This is ridiculous," Julia said, tossing the papers onto the table. "He's grasping at straws." "I know," Maya replied, sitting down across from her mentor. "But the damage is already done. He's trying to smear me, and even if it doesn't hold up in court, people will still talk." Julia leaned forward, her expression fierce. "Maya, you didn't win that case because of some underhanded tactic. You won because you were prepared, thorough, and better than him. Don't let this get to you, we'll fight it." Maya nodded, but her thoughts were already spinning. Ethan wasn't just attacking her career. He was attacking her integrity, her very identity as a lawyer. And that cut deeper than anything else. The motion would take weeks, possibly months, to be resolved. In the meantime, Maya's reputation would be under constant scrutiny. Every lawyer in the city would be watching, waiting to see if she cracked under the pressure. But Maya refused to let Ethan win this way. She had faced bigger challenges in her life, and she wasn't about to let a bitter, arrogant man like Ethan Cole destroy everything she had worked for. In the days that followed, Maya threw herself into preparing her defense. She knew she had done nothing wrong, but she needed to be meticulous. Every detail had to be perfect. Ethan was desperate, and desperate men made dangerous moves. As the days turned into weeks, Maya found herself fighting not just in court, but also against the rumors and whispers that had started to circulate about her. Some of her colleagues, once friendly and supportive, began to keep their distance. Others looked at her with thinly veiled suspicion. Maya had always known that being a black woman in law meant she would be held to higher standards than her peers. Any mistake, any hint of impropriety, could be used against her in ways it wouldn't for others. And now, Ethan had given people an excuse to doubt her, but despite the pressure, Maya stood firm. She continued to prepare her defense, to work on her cases, and to push forward, knowing that the truth would come out. Late one evening, Maya found herself sitting in Julia's office, the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on her. Julia looked up from her desk, sensing Maya's exhaustion. "You're carrying too much on your shoulders," Julia said softly. "You need to take a step back." Maya shook her head. "I can't. If I let up, if I show any weakness, Ethan will win, and I can't let that happen." Julia leaned back in her chair, studying Maya for a long moment. "Maya, Ethan's not going to win. He's already lost. The only way he can hurt you now is if you let him. Don't give him that power." Maya's eyes met Julia's, and for the first time in weeks she felt the tight knot of anxiety in her chest begin to loosen. "You've done everything right," Julia continued. "Now it's time to trust that the system will see that. Ethan's desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. Let him hang himself with his own rope." Maya nodded slowly, her mind clearer than it had been in days. Julia was right. Ethan's actions weren't about her. They were about him. He was trying to pull her down because he couldn't handle his own defeat, and she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. The day of the hearing arrived, and Maya stood in front of the judge, her hands steady and her voice calm. Ethan had presented his motion, but it was riddled with inconsistencies and unsupported claims. Maya knew it wouldn't hold up, and now it was her turn to dismantle his argument. With precise, methodical logic, she picked apart Ethan's accusations, exposing them for the lies they were. The judge listened intently, nodding as Maya presented her evidence, her case airtight. When it was over, the judge dismissed Ethan's motion, ruling in Maya's favor. It was a swift and decisive victory, but more than that, it was the end of Ethan's career. His desperation had led him to overplay his hand, and now his credibility was in shambles. His client dropped him, his firm distanced themselves, and whispers of his unprofessional behavior spread through the legal community. For Ethan Cole, the fall had been swift, and it had been final. The trial hadn't just been about losing a case for Ethan Cole, it had been about losing everything. Once at the pinnacle of his career, a high-powered attorney with a flawless reputation, Ethan never imagined that one case could unravel all he had worked for. But here he was, sitting in his office, surrounded by papers and unanswered phone calls, the weight of his failure crashing down on him. His client had severed all ties after the trial and the appeal, and his firm, once proud to have him as their golden boy, had begun distancing themselves. Their silence spoke louder than any words. The legal community, which had once admired him, now whispered about his humiliation behind his back. But none of that compared to the seething rage Ethan felt toward Maya Dawson. She had done this to him, humiliated him in court, shattered his career, and left him with nothing. The worst part was deep down, Ethan knew he had underestimated her. Maya had been prepared and he hadn't. She had beaten him fair and square. But admitting that to himself only made his anger fester deeper. He stared at his reflection in the office window, his face pale, his once sharp suit wrinkled from days of neglect. The pressure of it all, the failure, the collapse of his professional life, the loss of respect, it had pushed him to the edge. And in his desperation, Ethan began to blame Maya for everything, allowing his resentment to turn into something darker. Maya had finally begun to breathe again after weeks of intense pressure. The ruling in her favor had lifted the dark cloud hanging over her. She had won, not just the trial, but the appeal as well, proving to everyone, especially herself, that her hard work and integrity were stronger than Ethan's baseless accusations. Her reputation was intact, her career was on the rise, and her client, David Brooks, had come out of the legal battle with his business and dignity preserved. Things were looking up. But Ethan Cole wasn't done. It was late afternoon when Maya left the courthouse, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in weeks. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the city as she walked toward her car. But as she neared her vehicle, a familiar figure caught her eye. Ethan leaning against his black SUV, arms crossed, his face tight with barely concealed anger. Maya's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't seen him since the appeal, and now here he was, waiting for her. A sense of caution rose within her. The look in his eyes was dark, dangerous. "Maya," Ethan called out, his voice flat, devoid of the arrogance she once associated with him. Now there was something colder, more bitter. "We need to talk." Maya stopped a few feet away from him, keeping her expression calm. "I don't think we have anything left to discuss, Ethan. The case is over. The appeal is over." Ethan pushed himself off the car, stepping closer. "You ruined my life." Maya's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "You lost the case, Ethan. You lost because you weren't prepared, because you underestimated me and didn't do your job." His face twisted with anger. "You think you're better than me, don't you? You think you've won, but you don't realize what you've taken from me, my career, my reputation. It's all gone because of you." Maya took a deep breath, her heart racing. She knew this wasn't about the case anymore. Ethan wasn't just angry about losing. He was looking for someone to blame for the collapse of his life, and he had chosen her. "Ethan, I didn't do this to you," she said, her voice firm. "You did this to yourself. You made choices that led to where you are now. Blaming me won't change that." For a moment, Ethan just stared at her, his eyes burning with resentment. Then, without warning, he lunged forward, grabbing her arm and shoving her back against her car. Maya gasped, the force of the impact sending a jolt of pain through her back. "Let go of me," she demanded, her voice sharp. But Ethan wasn't listening. His grip tightened, his face inches from hers, his eyes wild with desperation. "You think you can just walk away from this? From what you've done to me?" Maya's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to let fear take over. She locked eyes with him, her voice steady despite the pain. "Ethan, you need to stop right now. This isn't going to end the way you think." At that moment, the blaring sound of police sirens cut through the tension. 2 police cars pulled up at the edge of the parking lot, their lights flashing. Officers stepped out, hands resting on their holsters as they approached. "Sir, step away from her," one of the officers commanded, his voice firm and authoritative. Ethan's grip on Maya loosened, and he stumbled back, his face suddenly filled with confusion. The officers quickly moved in, handcuffing him as he tried to protest. Maya stood there, her heart still racing, watching as Ethan was led away to the police car. His eyes met hers one last time, filled with bitterness and defeat. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice barely a whisper. "You'll pay for this." But Maya knew it was over. Ethan had crossed a line, and now he was going to face the consequences of his actions. The days following the assault were a whirlwind for Maya. The police had taken Ethan into custody, and now she was faced with the decision of whether or not to press charges. She had never imagined that their legal battle would escalate into something so dangerous. But now that it had, Maya knew she couldn't stay silent. Julia was the first person she called after the incident. "I can't believe he attacked you," Julia said, her voice filled with both anger and concern. "He's always been arrogant, but I didn't think he'd take it this far." Maya sighed, rubbing her temples as she sat in her office. "I didn't either, but now I have to decide what to do next. The police are ready to file charges, but part of me wonders if I should just let it go." Julia's voice softened. "Maya, he crossed a line. This wasn't just an argument. He physically assaulted you. If you don't press charges, what's to stop him from doing it to someone else? Maya knew Julia was right. Ethan's behavior had escalated to violence, and if she didn't hold him accountable, he could hurt someone else in the future. I'll press charges, Maya said, her voice firm. Ethan needed to face the consequences for what he had done. The legal proceedings against Ethan moved quickly. Maya had filed charges for assault, and with the testimony of witnesses and security footage from the courthouse parking lot, the case against him was strong. Ethan's reputation, already damaged by his losses in court, was now beyond repair. His law firm, once proud to have him as a senior partner, quickly severed ties. Ethan had become a liability. His violent outburst combined with rumors of professional misconduct made him a pariah in the legal community. The media picked up on the story, and soon Ethan's fall from grace became a public spectacle. For a man who had once prided himself on his success and reputation, the humiliation was unbearable. His name was splashed across headlines, his career left in ruins. Meanwhile, Maya remained focused on her work. The legal battle had taken its toll on her emotionally and physically, but she was determined to move forward. She had fought for justice, not only for her client, but for herself as well, and she refused to let Ethan's actions define her. The court found Ethan guilty of assault. He was fined and given a restraining order barring him from ever approaching Maya again. His career in law was effectively over. For Maya, the victory was bittersweet. She hadn't wanted things to escalate to this point, but she knew she had done the right thing. Ethan had tried to use his power and privilege to intimidate her, to tear her down, but in the end, it was his own arrogance and lack of control that had destroyed him. Weeks passed, and the dust from the legal storm began to settle. Maya returned to her routine, focusing on her clients and her work. The trial had put her on the map in the legal community, and her firm was receiving more high-profile cases than ever before. But more than the professional success, Maya felt a deep sense of personal triumph. She had faced not only Ethan Cole, but also the systemic challenges that came with being a black woman in a field dominated by men like him. She had proven that she was more than capable of standing her ground no matter how powerful the opposition. One afternoon, Maya sat in her office, staring out at the city skyline. The sun was shining brightly, casting a warm glow over the buildings, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Maya felt at peace. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced down to see a message from David Brooks, her client. "Thank you for everything, Maya. You've given me back my life. I'll never forget what you've done for me." Maya smiled, her heart full. The road had been long and difficult, but in the end, she had stood up for what was right. She had faced injustice, not just in the courtroom, but in her own life, and she had emerged stronger than ever. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave for the day, Maya felt a sense of closure. The battles she had fought, both legal and personal, had shaped her into the woman she was today. Though the journey had been filled with challenges, she knew she was ready for whatever came next. With a deep breath, she stepped out into the sunlight, ready to face the future with confidence and determination. In the early hours of the morning, Maya sat at her desk, her fingers resting lightly on a stack of case files. The dim light in her office bathed the room in a soft glow, and the faint hum of the city outside provided a steady background to her thoughts. It had been a few weeks since Ethan's sentencing, and while the drama surrounding the trial and his assault on her had subsided, the experience still lingered in her mind. She had won. She had fought the hardest battle of her career, both in the courtroom and outside it, and she had come out on top. But as she sat there reflecting, Maya felt a mixture of emotions: relief, pride, and even sadness. Ethan's downfall had been inevitable, but she hadn't wanted it to end in violence or destruction. Despite the trials she had faced, Maya knew the experience had made her stronger. She had confronted prejudice, both subtle and overt, and had fought to prove herself in a profession that wasn't always welcoming to women like her. She had earned the respect of her peers, her clients, and most importantly, herself. Her phone buzzed softly on the desk, interrupting her thoughts. She glanced down to see an email from the senior partners at her firm. They were offering her a promotion. Partner. Maya's heart skipped a beat as she read the message. Partner. It was the pinnacle of her career, a goal she had been working toward for years, and now it was within her grasp. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the feeling of accomplishment wash over her. She had earned this. Every long night spent working on cases, every obstacle she had overcome, had led to this moment. The recognition was more than just a title. It was a validation of her skills, her dedication, and her ability to stand tall in the face of adversity. But there was more to her success than professional accolades. Maya had learned to value her own voice, her own worth, in a system that often sought to undermine her. She had proven she could stand up to injustice, even when it came from people like Ethan who had tried to tear her down. And now, standing on the brink of this new chapter in her career, Maya felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. With a smile, she replied to the email, accepting the partnership offer. This wasn't just the end of one battle, it was the beginning of something bigger. Across the city, in a small, dimly lit apartment, Ethan Cole packed the last of his belongings into a suitcase. The once celebrated lawyer had become a pariah in the legal community, his name synonymous with arrogance, recklessness, and violence. His career was over, and there was no redemption in sight. The court's verdict had left him with little choice. He had been found guilty of assault, and the restraining order against him was permanent. No law firm in the city would touch him, and the few remaining connections he had in the legal world had distanced themselves after the scandal. Ethan had once prided himself on his power and success, on the way people respected or feared him in the courtroom. But now, all of that was gone. The man who had believed he could outsmart anyone, who had used his privilege and arrogance to belittle those he saw beneath him, was now forced to confront the reality of his own actions. His wife, Rachel, had left him shortly after the trial. She had grown tired of his self-destructive behavior, and after the assault on Maya, there was no saving their marriage. With his personal and professional life in shambles, Ethan faced a future filled with uncertainty and regret. The power he had wielded for so long had slipped from his grasp, and there was no going back. Ethan made the decision to leave the city altogether. As he zipped up his suitcase and glanced around the empty apartment one last time, a wave of bitterness washed over him. He had lost everything, and there was no one to blame but himself. Yet even as regret gnawed at him, a part of Ethan still clung to the idea that Maya Dawson had been the catalyst for his downfall. But deep down, he knew the truth. Maya hadn't destroyed him. He had destroyed himself. With a heavy sigh, Ethan picked up his suitcase and walked out the door, leaving behind the city and the life that had once been his kingdom. It was over. Maya, meanwhile, hadn't planned on celebrating her promotion in any grand way. After everything that had happened, she wanted something small, something meaningful. She invited Julia Anderson, her mentor, and David Brooks to a quiet dinner at her favorite restaurant, a cozy, unpretentious spot where she could finally take a moment to breathe and reflect. David arrived first, greeting her with a warm smile and a handshake that quickly turned into a hug. "I can't thank you enough, Maya," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You saved my business and my family's future. I don't know how I can ever repay you." "You don't have to repay me, David," Maya replied, smiling. "Just keep doing what you're doing. You deserve to win that case, and I'm glad I could help." David's eyes shone with emotion. He knew that Maya had done more than just win a case. She had restored his faith in justice, in the belief that the little guy could still stand up to the giants of the world and win. A few minutes later, Julia walked in, her presence commanding as always. She embraced Maya, her eyes twinkling with pride. "You've come a long way, Maya," Julia said as they sat down. "Partner at the firm, that's no small feat." Maya smiled, feeling a rush of warmth at Julia's words. "I couldn't have done it without you," she admitted. "You've been there every step of the way." Julia shook her head. "You did this on your own, Maya. I may have guided you, but you've always had the strength and the talent. You just needed to believe in yourself. As they enjoyed their meal and reflected on the challenges and victories of the past year, Maya realized just how far she had come. The battle with Ethan, the struggle to prove herself, the countless sleepless nights spent preparing for cases, all of it had led her to this moment. And though the road had been difficult, it had been worth it. In the weeks following her promotion, Maya found herself taking on more high-profile cases. Clients sought her out specifically for her reputation for integrity and fierce advocacy. The case with David Brooks had been a turning point, not just in her career, but in her life. One afternoon, as she sat in her office reviewing a new case, her phone buzzed. It was an email from a legal organization that focused on promoting diversity and inclusion. They wanted Maya to speak at an upcoming conference about her experiences as a Black woman in law and how she had navigated the challenges of the profession. Maya hesitated for a moment, her mind flashing back to all the obstacles she had faced along the way. But then she smiled, realizing this was exactly what she had been fighting for, not just for herself, but for those who would come after her. She replied to the email, accepting the invitation. It was time to share her story, to show others that no matter the challenges they faced, they could rise above them. That evening, as she left the office and walked into the warm glow of the setting sun, Maya felt a deep sense of peace. The battles she had fought, the professional struggles, the personal confrontations, the fight for justice, had shaped her into the person she was today. She knew there would always be more challenges ahead. The legal world was a tough place, and there would always be people like Ethan, people who underestimated her, people who would try to bring her down. But now, Maya knew she had the strength, the resilience, and the courage to face whatever came her way. As she walked down the street, her step steady and sure, Maya Dawson smiled to herself. The journey had been long, but she was just getting started. Years later, Maya would look back on this time in her life as the moment when everything changed. Her promotion to partner was only the beginning of a long and successful career filled with victories, challenges, and moments of profound personal growth. She became known not only as an exceptional lawyer, but as a mentor and advocate for young attorneys, especially women of color, who faced the same struggles she had. The legal community, once slow to recognize her, now celebrated her achievements. Maya was invited to speak at law schools, conferences, and panels, sharing her insights and experiences with the next generation of lawyers. Her voice became one of authority, compassion, and justice, a voice that demanded to be heard. Though she had faced men like Ethan Cole throughout her career, Maya never let their arrogance or prejudice define her. Instead, she used every battle, every victory, and even every setback as fuel to keep pushing forward, to keep fighting for what was right. Maya's legacy wasn't just about winning cases. It was about showing others that they too could stand up for justice, even in the face of overwhelming odds. In the end, that was her greatest victory of all. If you found Maya Dawson's journey inspiring, don't forget to subscribe for more uplifting and motivational stories of perseverance, justice, and personal triumph. Together, we'll continue to explore stories that empower, inspire, and remind us all to stay strong in the face of adversity. Hit the subscribe button now so you won't miss out on more impactful tales like Maya's.